Okay, getting to endgame here. Finite deterrence. Oh, I should tell you the story before I go further. Mr. Wohlstetter and others, when they briefed this, had a chance to talk to the captains of industry as well as the top brass. And in the mid-50s, the question that came up, which leads to this, was, well, when are we going to be done spending to take care of all these problems? And I remember Albert explaining in his class, well, there was a large table of portly men in their 50s, I guess. And when they asked this question, I said, well, it's a little bit like maintaining your weight after age 30. And he said, I could audibly hear everyone sucking in their stomach. And the point here is that this is a constant campaign to deal with cutting over these hurdles. Small countries, when they first get weapons, denigrate the requirements. They then get sucked into having to meet them, and it's very expensive. Wealthier countries have an easier time. It's not fair, but that's how it works. This doesn't recommend getting nuclear weapons. That's not my point. It's just that when you get into this, it's not for everybody in the same way. And this is what the response was to all these hurdles, which is, no, wait a minute. What is the minimum amount? What is the finite? You know, how many weapons do we need to deal with all of these requirements? It seems like it's an infinite number. Some people said, you know, you have to target our weapons against their weapons, and if they have more weapons, then we have to get more weapons. And it just goes back and forth till we have a zillion weapons. And if you take a look, in the 50s, we had close to a figure, you know, figuratively a zillion. We had, does anybody know how many weapons between us and the Soviets were deployed at the height of the Cold War? Get it wrong. Make a guess. 70. But who's counting? Okay. So that's a lot. People pushed back and said, you don't need that many. Here's why. This was the answer to the question that it's a finite number. And the two schools that pushed this for different reasons were the French and Arleigh Burke and the Polaris program for very different reasons. The French wanted to come up with a rationale for getting nuclear weapons after the Suez debacle, when we didn't back them. Something actually Eisenhower regretted. It's interesting that some presidents admit they make mistakes. He did. You read his memoirs. He said, that I didn't handle so well. One of the paybacks on that was the French going nuclear. And their problem was, well, okay, fine, now you've got a few bombs. How do you justify that? Well, the argument is, well, you know, we can't rely on the Americans or the British, even though they have troops and nuclear weapons. They won't jeopardize, have you heard this? New York. They won't trade New York for Paris, or now, what is it, LA for Seoul. You know? Same argument. So we got to get our own. And they then said, okay, that explains why we get them, but then how many do we need to get? Well, they didn't have much money. They said, well, we don't need many. Well, why is that? Well, we're just going to target some cities. We'll tear off an arm, they said. That should be good enough to scare the Soviets from any level of aggression. Well, so first they put out airplanes, and then they quickly discovered that those air bases were incredibly vulnerable to a very small proportion or number of Soviet missiles and planes. So then they put them in silos, and then when the silos became vulnerable, they had to spend money and have a nuclear submarine. Turned out the finite deterrent was not so cheap. Yeah? In any case, that's one area. Pierre Galois was one of the original, if you will, propagandists for this. They also dressed up the theory, I think, in a remarkably French fashion by saying, well, we don't just want to deter the Soviets, we want to deter everyone, including, I guess, the Americans, which seems kind of bizarre. The Navy, U.S. Navy, had a different reason for backing a finite deterrence theory, and that was they wanted to get in on the strategic mission of having nuclear weapons. SAC had everything. The Air Force had everything. And they argued, well, you know, those air bases are vulnerable. We can solve that problem if you just give us some missiles and put it on submarines. There were a couple of technical assumptions, however, about submarines. One, it's dark down there under the water. You can get lost. It's not so easy to know where you are. And when you shoot a missile, and in the early days they shot cruise missiles. They'd surface and they'd shoot a cruise missile. They had gyros, and the gyros had a drift rate, which meant that the longer they flew, the more they flew off course. And when they initially thought about ballistic missiles on submarines, they thought, well, we'll be lucky if we hit land. So they said, we better pick a large target, city. So they said, well, that's a plus, actually, because you don't need many weapons to hit cities. They don't move, and they're not defended. So they argued that this was what, in fact, they were going to go after, and that this would cheapen the cost of the nuclear force in the U.S. Now, a couple of things happened that they didn't expect. The missiles turned out to be a heck of a lot more accurate. Now, the missiles are as accurate at sea as they are on land. So that kind of loused things up, because immediately they started putting it into the PSYOP to hit military targets rather than cities. And I don't know exactly how inexpensive the submarine program is, but my guess is it's up there. It's a big portion of that. Finite deterrence, despite these facts that undermine the original rationale, still very popular. And the reason it is partly, one reason is arms control. If you want to bring numbers down, you start targeting, well, cities. And you say you just need a finite number. If you want to come down, finite deterrence definitely is an alive proposition. And I think, there always is a shift in opinion in American public policy when there's a major change in the executive. So, this could be coming back. I think in addition, a finite deterrence is attractive to smaller countries because when they first get them, they use these arguments. Last comment. Well, do these weapons deter or not? We have some historical examples. I mean, we threatened to use nuclear weapons or hinted at it in the Korean War. And some people say that that helped bring the armistice, or at least the ceasefire. I shouldn't say armistice, ceasefire. In Suez, the American interest in ending hostilities and the Russian counter threats escalated to a point where it became imperative for hostilities to cease. The Cuban Missile Crisis, it can be argued, was brought to a head by fear and loathing about nuclear use. And there's this complicated example of the Israeli nuclear weapons in 73. Some people argue this is proof that deterrence worked for Israel. Other people argue that the threat of us going to DEFCON 3 when the Soviets threatened to come into the region is the reason it de-escalated. So that's a possibility. Then there's the South African argument that they had weapons to deter invasions of Angola, which I think stretches into flakiness. Each one of these arguments, as strong as they are, and they are, I think it's improbable that none of them participate in the truth. I mean, I got to believe one of these things, or all of them, participate in the truth. Nonetheless, there are counter-arguments for each one of these, saying, no, 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 that isn't what happened. I think that's where we are at the end. And that's okay, because you know what that means? It's inconclusive. And if it's inconclusive, we have to come to the next lecture.